Please remain seated. We're moving right now into our next session. There will be a break later. So I would ask the Honourable Tony Clement and Alain Dubuc to come to the stage, and I will introduce Alain Dubuc, who will be presenting our next speaker. Alain Dubuc is a national affairs columnist. Where are you, Alain? Oh, yeah, okay. For the Montreal Daily La Presse. He's also been publisher of Le Soleil. He obtained his master's degree in economics at the Université de Montréal. He is a frequent guest speaker, panelist at conferences on economic, social, and political issues across Quebec and Canada. Il était nommé officier au sein de l'Ordre du Canada et ainsi qu'il est membre aussi du conseil d'administration de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill ainsi que du conseil d'administration de l'Institut de recherche en politique publique, a long-time friend and supporter of the Institute. So, Alain?
Merci, Will, pour cette présentation. Bonjour à vous tous. C'est avec plaisir que je présente le premier conférencier d'honneur de cette conférence, l'Honourable Tony Clement. Mr. Clement, I learned that, is a lawyer. He has been a provincial politician in Northern Ontario, and he became a member of parliament in 2006 for Parry Sound, Muskoka. Mr. Clement has been an important minister of the Harper government. He served as Treasury Board President, Minister of Health, and Minister of Industry, where he played a important role during the crisis we had in 2009 to help Canada get back on track. Mr. Clement has been re-elected last October, and he is now the foreign affairs critic for the official opposition, Mr. Clement. So he'll have a presentation, and then there's a period of questions. Mr. Clement.
Donc, merci pour votre accueil chaleureux. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous pour cette conférence à McGill, une université très célèbre dans notre pays et partout le monde, je pense aussi. Thank you for inviting an Ontarian to downtown Montreal when the Canadiens aren't even playing. You couldn't even cheer for them in the hometown here, but it is great to be back here, even on a snowy, chilly day in Montreal, and to be part of a conference as the foreign affairs critic. I most recently served as president of the Treasury Board of Canada in the previous government, of course, and mostly that meant sitting in a small windowless room cutting budgets, making friends wherever I went, as you can imagine. But it is a great honor, even while serving in the official opposition, to be the foreign affairs critic for the Conservative Party of Canada, and to think about these issues that affect our country, not only at home, but our relationships abroad as well. And it gives me an opportunity to speak to many different groups within our country as well. Diasporas, of course, but also academic groups, groups such as this around the country as well. I recently found myself at the University of Toronto at a seminar that was being run on the role that religion plays in some of our foreign policy challenges around the world. So I was sitting in between, on one side of me, a Christian Orthodox priest from the Antioch Church, and on the other side of me, an imam, and there was me. And I just felt that one of these things is not like the other. I'm no religious scholar, I must say, and I mentioned that when I was in my days as a university student, we spent a lot more time worrying and arguing about where the next pub crawl was going to be rather than these weighty issues. But I think we're in a different world now where even our student populations, or perhaps even especially our student populations, are concerned about the future of not only Canada, but its relationship with the world as well. So it's good to see that McGill, of course, is a place where that occurs with great frequency as well. What I wanted to do with my time was just talk a little bit about the Conservative Party's positions on some of the major issues that are coming up already in foreign policy. And we're seeing with the new government, of course, a rapid change of direction and on emphasis, as one would expect with the new government. And that in itself means that there are some disagreements. I would say some of them are profound between ourselves as the official opposition and the government of the day. Now, let me just state for the record, of course, the Trudeau government was duly elected by the citizenry of Canada to be the government. They have a majority government. They are busy interpreting their mandate from the people of Canada, and that's as it should be in a democracy. But opposition parties also play a role. They are in the House of Commons to bring forward different points of view, to pose questions, to demand answers, and that's how we get in the House of Commons, the crucible of our democracy, that exchange of ideas and arguments. So I would say that there's nothing wrong or inherently wrong with disagreement in the House of Commons. It really is where, if you're going to have disagreement, and surely to goodness we're not going to agree on every issue, that should be the place where it occurs. And so I hope it's not shocking to you that I'm going to disagree with the Trudeau government on some of its foreign policy stances. That's our role. And of course, the people of Canada have the right to decide whether I'm on the right track or whether they're on the right track or whether the NDP is on the right track, and so on and so forth. But let me just to go through this tour d'horizon a little bit and of course, take any questions you have. The first, of course, is the most recent announcement by Mr. Trudeau and his ministers on the fight against ISIS or Islamic State or Daesh or whatever term is au courant here in Montreal. Islamic State is, in our view, a clear and present danger to our society. They are, of course, wreaking violence and havoc in the region that was hitherto controlled by Iraq and Syria, and in fact, other regions in the Middle East as well. And as you know, there's been a 60-country coalition that has been seeking to limit their growth of territory. And this is what makes them different from most terrorist organizations. Their command of territory, including the city of Mosul, which is a city of over 1 million people, and their ability to project violence not only within the areas that they control, but also to project it to other countries well outside the region, most recently, of course, in the Paris attacks, but also most recently as well in Indonesia and the United States and other countries besides. They are also in the midst of attracting soldiers from our countries, from around the world, to fight there, but also to seek to do violence and damage in their home countries as well. So this is a very different, markedly different threat than some other terrorist organizations, although there's no such thing as in my view, as a good terrorist organization. The level of security threat to our interests does change. As you know, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that we would be ending the combat mission, the air mission, on the 22nd of February, and upping the training and institution building aspect of the mission. So from our point of view, this was a very unfortunate announcement. At a time when the British government, the French government, the American government, other allies are seeking to increase the pressure on Islamic State to dislodge them from the territory that they control, we are actually stepping back from that fight. That's not the tradition of the Canadian military. It's not in our security interests. and I believe it's not in our political interests either. The fact of the matter is that we count less if we're not part of the air mission, not that that should be the be-all and the end-all. The fact is our air women and men do an excellent job in what they do in targeting the ordinance to take out positions that are controlled by Islamic State with a minimum of casualties of civilians, and that it helps, of course, have any ground campaign by the Kurds or other, by the Iraqi troops and others who are on the ground when you have that air cover. And Canadians are very good at this, and it's unfortunate that we are no longer part of that mission. The other interesting thing, of course, is by adding training officers to the ground, as our Chief of Defense Staff has indicated, that actually increases the risk of casualties that are possible, because whenever you're doing training on the ground near the front, that will, of course, attract the firepower of Islamic State. So we are, obviously that was a clear difference between ourselves as the opposition. I should state, if Hélène Laverdière were here today rather than tomorrow, she'd say that the Liberals haven't gone far enough in getting out of the mission. So there's no agreement amongst the opposition parties on what the right position is, except that the Liberal position is the wrong position. So welcome to Canadian politics, I suppose. I did want to talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine as well, because that's an area where there is starting to be some profound disagreement. This all started with the media reports coming out of the G20 meeting in Turkey, media reports that started with the comments by the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, that in fact the Prime Minister and President Putin had discussed normalizing relations with the Russians. That was the first Canadians ever heard of that foreign policy change, and it did excite some controversy. The reason is, of course, because 2 years ago the Russians invaded Crimea, which was a sovereign territory of their neighbor Ukraine, and once that was accomplished, using regular and irregular forces, has been active in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, seeking to destabilize their western neighbor and prevent Ukraine from any kind of rapprochement with the European Union or with other countries other than Russia. There was international agreement, including the European nations, that there would be a series of sanctions against Russia for doing this. We've also bolstered our forces in Poland and our military activity with the Baltic nations, other countries that feel threatened by Russian adventurism. Of course, we've tried to isolate Russia politically and diplomatically, particularly kicking them out of the G8, creating the G7, and other international conferences where it made sense. Now, this is what you can say about Vladimir Putin. He doesn't engage in dialogue without seeking a quid pro quo. So this idea that, and this is in paraphrasing, but this is basically the approach of the current government, that it's always better to dialogue than to not dialogue. I understand where that comes from. I mean, Winston Churchill was always the one who said it's better to jaw than to war, and I get that. But when you are seeking with your allies, with Europe, with the United States, with other countries, to isolate an aggressor who uses military power in the Europe of the 21st century to achieve his political aims, I can tell you that Vladimir Putin doesn't just want a dialogue with Canada. He will want a quid pro quo. He will want the lifting of certain sanctions. He will want to divide and conquer us from our natural allies for the sake of Russian foreign policy objectives. So it's the height of naivety to think that more of a dialogue with President Putin is going to achieve any objective other than the objectives of President Putin. And so that's our major disagreement with the Liberal government on that issue, and of course, it sends the wrong signal of being less than supportive of Ukraine, which of course is the innocent party in all of these matters. So that's a second point of disagreement. The third point of disagreement I want to bring up is Iran, and this, of course, flows out of the nuclear deal that the United States did ink with the Iranian regime, and the promise that flows from that of reducing or eliminating the sanctions. So, of course, I'm well aware that that deal was done by President Obama and President Rouhani of Iran, and that the logical consequence of that would be that if they meet certain thresholds and agreed upon activities to reduce the nuclearization of Iran's military, that of course there would be some sanctions lifting which would follow. So I'm not disputing that. I guess my quibble is with the rapidity of the lifting of sanctions, where I think Canada and its allies would be best to move slowly until greater confidence building and benchmarks were met by Iran. And secondly, and this is the part that really stuck in my craw, was the simultaneous language coming from the government of Canada that they would seek ways to normalize relations with Iran. And that, to me, is altogether the wrong message to give to the Iranians. And I say that for these reasons. Number one, they are still a state sponsor of terror. And by state sponsor of terror, what I mean is it is still state policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to sponsor and support and fund terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like Al-Qaeda. It's a line item in their budget, you know, where we might have line items to deal with infrastructure spending or what have you. Part of their infrastructure spending appears to be supporting terrorist organizations, which of course do violence across the region and the world. So that's the first difficulty. They are still listed as a state sponsor of terror by the Canadian government. They also have a matter of state policy, the eradication of Israel from the face of the earth. So this, again, is state policy of Iran. They also, at the time simultaneous to the lifting of these sanctions, are in violation of UN resolutions pertaining to building up ballistic missile technology. So at a time when they say they are promising to do all the right things when it comes to denuclearization, they are in fact building up their ability to carry nuclear and other warheads in direct violation of UN resolutions. And so while the United States of America was lifting sanctions on Iran, they were simultaneously adding sanctions to Iran because of their violation of UN resolutions. Hardly a matter of good faith by the Iranian government that they were continuing these other policies at the same time as the nuclear deal was being inked and implemented. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of the intentions of the Iranian government. I mean, things on the road to Damascus may occur, but what we should do is reward uniformly good behavior, where Iran is making a conscious effort to rejoin the family of peaceful nations. They are, of course, a great destabilizing element within the region, including the fight against Islamic State and the nature of bolstering the Assad regime in Syria. And so there's a lot of regional reasons why they are a problematic country, but certainly with respect to other countries outside the region, these issues remain. So where does that put us? Where does that take us? I think when you look at foreign policy, any foreign policy of any government, it has to be, at least in a democratic world, consistent with two basic concepts. The two basic concepts are that the foreign policy has to accord with the interests and the security of the country. That's what foreign policy should do. Any Canadian foreign policy should increase Canadian security and be consistent with Canadian interests around the world. The second thing that foreign policy should do, this is at sometimes cross purposes with point one, but foreign policy should represent the values and the principles of the country which is executing that foreign policy. And in our case, I would put it to you that our values and principles include human rights, include peaceful resolution of issues, and the role of self-determination amongst other things. So that's how we should measure ourselves. Do we always measure up? I would put it to you that that's very difficult to do, but those are at least the ways in which we can look at foreign policy issues and assess whether they are meeting the values and the interests of Canadians and Canada. And I would put it to you that it is part of my role as the foreign affairs critic for the Conservative Party to continue to ask these questions of our new Liberal government, to make sure that whatever they do is based on those kind of touchstone issues, our interests and our values, and make sure that it is something of which we can be proud and which will, again, enhance our own security and our own feelings about human rights and our own feelings about what we value as Canadians in this country and abroad as well. So we're into a period of change, as befits a change of government. We're into a period where I think there will be some very interesting discussions about the role of the foreign policy in Canadian politics. And it's going to be one where I think we'll need not only parliamentarians, but yourselves as interested observers, students and academics and members of the general public, to weigh in on these issues when you feel there's something that is not in accordance with how you see the world. And I think the great thing about foreign policy is we can all have opinions, and I think there's a certain validity in having that debate. We don't all have to be former diplomats to have points of view on these issues. We can be Canadians with our own experiences and our own backgrounds and our own points of view on these. And to me, that's the legitimate discussion to have. And I look forward to groups like this, conferences like this, and other conferences around the country being part of that dialogue as well. Thank you for your time. I think we're supposed to have a Q&A at this point.
Indeed, I can direct traffic.
Sure, yeah, that's great.
Just remind you, please pose your question in the form of a question.
I'll take foreign policy for 200.
Raise your voice at the end. That's one way of doing it.
Last week, Bernie Sanders was asked to rank North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran in order of the threat they pose to the U.S. He said, first North Korea, second Iran, third Russia. Do you agree with his analysis for Canada? And if so, why? And if not, a different order, why not?
Yeah, I wouldn't put North Korea as number one, although they have the missiles that can reach our borders. It's always difficult to assess what's going on in North Korea and how much of it is for show and how much of it relates to internal politics. There's a number of people being executed off and when I say executed, I mean executed off their national security board or what have you. So there may be some internal politics going on. There always is, perhaps, in Pyongyang. I would put Russia closer to the top because we, of course, share a border with them in the Arctic Circle. And I think it's always a concern when Russia is being bellicose. And with Putin, it's not just a question of rhetorical bellicosity. It's actually he projects Russian power and violence to achieve his political ends. So that always worries me about what he intends to do about the Arctic Circle, and of course that impinges directly on our interests in there. I would put Iran, I guess in the order, I'd put Iran closer to the top of the list, actually, because through their state sponsoring of terrorist activities, that can have a direct influence on the lives of Canadians, which should always be a top priority in preserving and protecting. And so we saw in Burkina Faso, for instance, that was an al-Qaeda group that was active in the terrorist attacks in Ouagadougou, and that 6 Canadians perished as a result of that. Islamic State, an Islamic State cell was active in it in Indonesia recently, and a Canadian died there. And of course, we all saw the carnage that occurred with the Paris attacks that, but for the grace of God, could have been any modern Western city that was attacked. So I think I respect Mr. Sanders, of course. We all want to feel the burn a little bit after seeing the result in New Hampshire, perhaps, but I would place him in a little bit of a different order than he did.
So everybody tweeting that, Tony Clement and Bernie Sanders?
Feel the burn. I just wanted to say feel the burn. I wanted to be part of that meme, so now I've done that.
Thank you, Mr. Clement. I noticed how in your speech you touched upon the divergences between your camp and the government of Mr. Trudeau, specifically in the areas of sanctions and how to approach the problem of isolating what we see as geopolitical enemies. Bearing in mind that recently, just a couple of months ago, there was a trans-institutional study between Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard that found that sanctions work as a policy about only 20% of the time, and more often than not, they actually seek to galvanize the public against the sanction setters, such was the case in Iran and in Serbia in the 90s, along with isolation, where we see that isolation isn't always equally instituted, so because we've seen other such aggressions of the Russian nature from countries such as Pakistan or India or even China in more expanded memory. So bearing all these nuances to these truths in mind, are we more preoccupied with following through with the policy objectives from an ideological perspective, or are we more interested in getting the job done with respects to these are the policy initiatives that we have set out, and we may allow for some inconsistencies, but it's most important that we stay faithful to our policy objectives, no matter the outcome.
Yeah, no, that's a very good series of points there. I'd say two things, perhaps, in response to that. Firstly, when I look at the cases of Iran and Russia, I would say that the sanctions so far are achieving the objectives that were set out. So in the case of Iran, there's no question that the falling price of oil, as well as the sanctions, had an impact in getting Iran back to the bargaining table for the nuclear deal. So in that sense, I think that you can claim a certain amount of success. In Russia, again, the price of oil plus sanctions are hurting the right people, that is to say the oligarchs and those around Putin. Can Russia withstand the sanctions? Absolutely they can. There's no question about it. And that's my second point. My second point is, as a former policymaker myself, you can't judge sanctions just in isolation. Sanctions are part of the range of policy choices given to policymakers, given that there's an untoward event that has occurred. In the case of Russia, let's say, the invasion of Ukraine, totally contrary to the values and principles that Europe should be run by in the 21st century, right? You don't solve political differences by invading your neighbor. So given that, what are your choices? At one end, the choice is do nothing, which rewards bad behavior and creates a moral hazard. On the other hand, there's military involvement. No one seriously contemplated military involvement against Russia in that situation. And then you've got in the middle sanctions. So given the policy choices available, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is a way to show international disapproval, a way to coordinate international action, a way to create, hopefully, hurt with the right people and not the wrong people, and therefore gives the world community a chance to react without creating World War III, I guess, in the particular case that I was mentioning. So that's the context. As a former policymaker, that's the context in which a lot of these decisions are made. Yeah, good question, though.
Andrew Cadell, I work currently at Global Affairs. The Prime Minister has just announced he's going to seek out a seat on the Security Council.
Yes.
Canada will for 2020, I presume. In retrospect, what do you think we did wrong in 2010? What do you think we should do looking towards 2020? And should we be pursuing a seat on the Security Council?
So I think it's perfectly natural for Canada to seek a seat. I think our chances would be very good. I'd be surprised if they were poor, given that we were rejected one time, the last time, and so I think that we've got a good moral argument that the time is now. So let me set the bar high for Mr. Trudeau and say I can't imagine that we wouldn't get the seat, and if we do, there's something really wrong. So I'll just set that bar high for Mr. Trudeau and his announcement. Look, I think a lot went wrong with our bid last time, but I think to make it right would have cost too much in terms of our policy positions and the values that we share as Canadians. Like, if the price of admission is turn your back on Israel, I don't think it's worth that price of admission, as an example. So there's always a lot in these kinds of organizations. There's lots of individual state-to-state dialogues that take place as you accumulate support for votes to be admitted into the UN Security Council. And so in the midst of that horse trading, if I can be blunt and bold, you have to make commitments as a government to each of these individual states. And clearly, we were on the wrong side of certain issues that some of these states cared about. The other thing that happened, if I may, I think Lawrence Cannon has been public about this, so I can repeat it. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. I think I'm making this number up, but it's something like, I think we had commitments from 120 countries, and we got fewer than 136 countries, and we got fewer than half of their votes. Okay, so, it's kind of like the Olympic bid process. You get a lot of commitments from people or organizations, or in this case, states, and sometimes they follow through and other times they don't. So that's part of the difficulty of this kind of process for the Security Council. But having said all that, since we were rejected a few years ago, I'm sure that we'll be accepted this time. So that was an easy one for Mr. Trudeau to promise.
I should say thank you for remarks and for taking my question. My question was, we mentioned that Iran was a destabilizing force in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Do you think in the fight against the Islamic State, Iran could be a stabilizing force, and that it could exert a central authority in the region that's lacking right now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here's where I think it's going. I hope I'm not being too optimistic about it, but I think what's happening is that what you will see is an alignment, finally, of forces that will make it easier for many sides to coalesce and to oust Islamic State from its territorial gains. So what do I mean by that? So I mean that who are the players? You've got Turkey, you've got Russia, you've got Syria, you've got Iran, you've got Iraq, you've got the United States and the alliance. I'm probably missing somebody. But I think Saudi, you got Saudi as well, Saudi Arabia. I think we've been through this period now of the last few months where a number of these states were part of what was happening on the ground, against Islamic State, but we're also pursuing their own agendas. So the Iranians wanted to be part of that, but they also wanted to support their friend and ally Syria, the Assad. The Saudis wanted to oust Islamic State, but they didn't want Iran to grow and influence as a regional power. The Americans wanted to oust Islamic State, but they didn't want to give any support to Assad. There's all these things happening where one could say the primary objective was a little bit hostage to all these secondary objectives. So, but I think what's happening is, I think the major players are realizing that they're not going to make the progress they need to make if they keep having these secondary objectives. So I think if I could predict, and maybe I hope I'm not being rose-colored glass, Pollyanna, these are terms you don't know because you're too young, but too overly optimistic to say that at some point the major players will get together and say, look, okay, this isn't working. We're going to have to accommodate one another a little bit, put water in our wine on our objectives, and let's work together to deal with the primary objective, which is to deny Islamic State its territory where it's wreaking havoc around the world. So maybe that's what I hope it happens, but I think there's a real opportunity for that to happen in the near future. We'll see whether I'm right or not. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Clementine from the International Relations Student Association of McGill, and I just wanted to know what are some ways that you think a conservative government can affect the impact and the image of Canada in intergovernmental forums like the UN compared to a liberal one?
In terms of international fora like the UN?
Yeah.
Yeah, so sure. So I think, let me just state something radical. As a conservative, I think we have to engage in international fora. And I think that that's part of how you run a country like Canada. You do have to be engaged in these fora, including the United Nations. And I would say, however, that it's important to stand up for certain principles. And certain organizations like the United Nations have to be reformed. When you've got sub-organizations within the UN, like the Human Rights Agency that they had there that was run for a time by the Libyans, as an example, something is inherently wrong with that it doesn't accord to our perception of what a human rights organization should be. And so there does have to be, I would be all in favor of pursuing reforms within the UN to make it a more internally consistent organization, knowing full well that it's run by the member states, but I think it makes itself less relevant when these kinds of things happen. So the way you do that is to be engaged, and I think a conservative government would be engaged in those kind of reform initiatives in those fora. Let me just talk about other fora though, because this is really the issue. What is the relevancy of the post-Second World War architecture as we approach the G0 world? That's going to be your exam question. But it's a good question because China has been seeking to be engaged in the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund and other organizations that have served, one could say, although there's certainly valid criticisms, has served the international order well to maintain some stability in the post-war era, Second World War era. But there's increasing evidence that China is getting a little bit impatient with the West's desire to incorporate China in on the Western terms. Let's put it that way. So what is China doing? China is creating its own organizations. So it's creating its own international bank. Don't need the IMF anymore. It's creating its own infrastructure fund. Don't need the World Bank anymore. It's creating its own trade blocs. Don't need the World Trade Organization anymore. So at some point, this is going to create some stress within these organizations that we're very familiar with, us in the post-war era, and it will continue to pose the question of how relevant those can be without a fundamental rethink or with a fundamental change of Chinese policy, which is also very possible as the stresses and strains of emerging into the first world continue in the People's Republic of China. So I guess we're bequeathing to you a world where things are a little bit mixed up on some of these issues, and it is a legit question to ask how relevant some of these fora are going to be in the future, despite the relevancy in the past.
Hello, my name is Marie Lamenche. I work at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. My question is, basically we're focusing a lot on the Islamic State, which is legitimate, but we're kind of putting aside the problem of the Syrian regime, and the Assad regime killed more people than ISIS now. And my question is, looking back at 2011, 2012, when it all started, and looking at it now, what would you do? Or would you do anything differently?
If I was president of the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this whole red line thing I don't think worked out very well, where President Obama said, we're not going to intervene, because we don't do that anymore militarily. But if you cross this red line of chemical weapons, we're really going to intervene. And then, of course, there's lots of evidence that Assad used chemical weapons against his people, and nothing happened. So as soon as that happened, I think that was the opening whistle for further depredations. And of course, having this civil war last as long as it has created this mass migration. And now a lot of the mass migration that's continuing is occurring because of the Russian intervention. So they're bombing like crazy, and that's creating more of a migrant crisis. And the knockdown effect is it's a major destabilizing factor in European politics, which is creating the rise of nativist parties, which is becoming more of a phenomenon even in certain primaries in the United States. And so it really does have a knockdown effect in terms of our politics, quite apart from the misery it's creating for individual people. So, yeah, I mean, I think, look at, President Obama was elected to get them out of the mess that was created by a previous administration. That's how he interpreted his mandate. So he got out of Iraq. That created a power vacuum that Islamic State was happy to enter, and you can blame, I'm not blaming Obama, the Maliki administration should take the lion's share of the blame there, but the reality is when there's a political and military vacuum, bad things can happen. And so that, in combination with the Syrian civil war, created this situation. I think the philosophy of the U.S. administration right now is, and I totally understand it, is stop getting involved massively militarily in places where you're going to mess up 3 years down the line. I get that. And that's been the history of their intervention since 9/11 in that region. So I'm not taking issue with that. But there's also this other consequence. And do we have the solution? I don't think anybody has the solution. But when it comes to the immediate impact of what to do with Islamic State, I do believe we have an inherent security/moral interest in denying them territory, because when they have territory, they kill a lot of people, and they use it to project their violence to our shore as well. So I'm I have a lot of clarity when it comes to that issue. How to reassemble peace, order, and stability in the Middle East, I hope it's not your grandkids that figure it out. I hope I hope we can figure that out. Modern history is not good with examples of that. Henry Kissinger once said, if you can leave office while not making things worse in the Middle East, you're doing pretty well, you know, and not many can say that. So that's the challenge that we're all facing. I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's my observation anyway. Yeah.
One last question, sir.
Hi, my name is Sauraj, and I'm a third-year student at this hotel's Faculty of Management. You mentioned China and how they were adding to the IMF special currency reserves recently, and my question is regarding that China's internal economy recently has been restructuring, as we saw in the last few months, that the commodity demands have been dropping drastically, and they're fueling their consumer service sector inside their economy and shifting what's been going on for the last 20 years or so, where the WTO, in fact, was very fundamental in adding to the growth of the Chinese economy. And with the G20 coming up in September, it's going to be the first time that it's going to be held in China. And a lot of experts around the world expect that China is going to be suggesting major changes to the global monetary system. And you mentioned the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Asian Development Bank, whereas if you look at Europe and Americas, they already have those systems in place. There's the biggest investment development bank is the European Investment Bank, and that is apart from the IMF or the WTO. So why is it necessarily a bad thing, or maybe I heard you wrong, that why China is adding these things for Asia?
Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I guess what I was commenting on was the failure of the consensus of how to deal with China's rise. So 5 years ago, if we were having this conversation, the consensus view would be China's rise is not inherently dangerous so long as we can accommodate them and manage their rise within existing Western institutions like the IMF, World Bank, Bretton Woods, et cetera, reserve currency being the US dollar, et cetera, right? So that was the kind of consensus of the experts and the political class on how to manage it. Invite China in, start to alter their behavior, like, you know, if you want to be in WTO, you got to kind of have rule of law, stop stealing our patents, and accept that free trade needs transparency and statistics, et cetera, right? So those were the kind of the conditions of WTO, let's say, and so that was how they were going to manage China's rise. Well, what we're seeing now is China saying, yeah, that was all very interesting, but we think the US dollar shouldn't be the reserve currency. That gives too much power as the debtor nation of the universe, the United States, to manage global affairs, even though they're the biggest debtor in the world, in world history. I guess maybe the Spanish were worse per capita. But anyway, aside from the Spaniards, the US. So we're not going to buy into that anymore. We want a different basket of reserve currencies than the US, just merely the US dollar. We're not going to accept the terms and conditions of the World Bank or the IMF when it comes to infrastructure or financing of projects. We've got our own bank. It's a better bank. Please join, et cetera. So it's clear to me that the old model obviously hasn't worked because they're creating a brand new model. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the world? It depends on your view of Chinese intentions. You know, if their intentions are primarily peaceful and coexisting, then it's not a problem at all. If because of destabilization in China, as they seek to deal with the democratic deficit at the time that growth is slowing, and that creates a market in China for more nationalistic policies as a way to corral the public into rallying behind the corrupt and discredited Chinese Communist Party, so that you have more aggression around the borders of China, then that could be a problem. I don't know what the future holds, neither do you, but that's the kind of issue that we have to worry about, I would say.
Okay, please join me in extending a warm thank you to
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Pleasure.